Welcome back to the Meaning Academy podcast. Baruch Halevi here with my good friend, Dr. Daniel Franz. Dr. Dan, what's happening?
Everything and nothing, my brother. All kinds of good stuff. Keeping busy, keeping the Meaning Academy top of mind for me. Just always working on the stuff we're doing. The Meaning Masterminds we have every Thursday at 3 p.m. right after recording this, and then trying to figure out what else our meaning seekers want. That's been a lot of fun, right? You and I have had ideas. We've been working on this, goodness sake, a year now or so, and really bringing it to fruition in the past couple months with our meaning masterminds. And now I think we're at a point of just, putting it out there. What more can we do to serve this community, and how do we um, grow this message?
That's right. As we're recording this, we're sort of winding down or wrapping up this summer. Lots of good, vacation time, experiences, exploration. But I know you're in the same place as me. It's like, let's hit this fall running. Let's get some new programming. And so we're, putting it out there to our listeners. What are you interested in?
Mm-hmm.
Our thoughts are some, of course, Viktor Frankl exploration through academics, but just a little teaser. I do imagine one day we'll have the Viktor Frankl meaning experience going overseas back to his homeland. So I'm kind of playing with that right now, exploring what that might mean to go on a tour of Viktor Frankl's life. But what? Tell us, send us emails, let us know what you're interested in.
Well, I know that very idea has brought one individual to tears hearing it live. And I know every time I think about it, I get a little pretty excited. And okay, another spoiler alert since we're putting it out there. Had the pleasure of chatting with, I said this to my wife this morning. I said, it's pretty cool that I get to email Viktor Frankl's grandson when I feel like it, and he usually gets back to me, and that his former son-in-law is also somebody that I get to interact with. So emailed Alex Vesely and his dad, Franz, yesterday. I said, hey, look, I'm thinking about, spending some time in Vienna here in the next year. Where is it good? Where do I start? Where's some good places to see Dr. Frankl history? And they both got back to me this morning, which might be afternoon their time, but said, hey, here's a link, here's a list, here's all the cool places you can go. And if you know when you're coming, Alex said, hit me up, love to meet up and show you some personal places too. So very cool. This idea that we had just a few months ago, maybe even longer for you, is really getting some meat on it. I mean, it's not going to be long before, this podcast and this academy becomes a tour of, not just, touching Dr. Frankl's life. I'm so excited for that. It's going to be amazing.
Well, and also with our curriculum, just sharing out loud what we have come to, but excuse me, um, we want it to be not just academic. Academic is part of it, knowledge, intellectual, engaging, but also experiential, because the topics, certainly the topic we're going to take on right now, but also, the work of Dr. Frankl, and I think the greatness of logotherapy. One sec. Still recovering from long illness. Is that it's logotherapy is to be lived. And I think that's one of the reasons why we both struggle calling it logotherapy, because logotherapy has a negative connotation, or a particular connotation, which is
Right.
academic by nature or clinical by nature, or something that happens behind closed doors. When the work of Viktor Frankl was meant to be lived out in the marketplace, out in the real world, out in your business, in your marriage, whatever. And so, whatever we do, I know we're committed to both academics, but also experience.
Well, and I think that's the funny thing about us. You and I can go neck deep into the academia of logotherapy pretty quickly, pretty easily. We've studied it, the better portion of our professional lives, and it takes our good friend Scott on the Meaning Masterminds to bring it to the practical world. Like, so how do you apply this to poker? Which I just saw the release of your new podcast with Scott talking about responsible and meaningful poker play. Can't wait to listen to that. But it's so true, and I think that's why we need audience participation. Like, what kind of experiences, right? Yeah, we can put together a big, expansive, 10 to 14 day trip to touch these milestones of logotherapy and Dr. Frankl. But what else do you need? We have thrown around you. I don't even want to count the days and hours. We have thrown around this curriculum for a course in logotherapy, and realize it is it's just too dang academic. It's heady. How do we put together experiences? My comments the other day leaning towards more of maybe a group, process group, or a psychotherapy group or something online. But what is it that people want? We know the message is needed out there. How do people want to live and receive that message?
That's a great segue into today's podcast, which we're going to be exploring what Dr. Frankl called the blessing of bearing your burdens. The blessing of bearing your burdens. What does that mean? Well, in order to get there, I want to just take us back a few years, like 100 years. And I'm going to share with you some statistics I just found. My wife's grandmother, we called Ma, would have been turning 100, I think, today or tomorrow. And so I just was thinking about her, and I think, well, what was her life like in 1923? Is that right? Yeah, 1923. And I just came across the following. In 1923, the average life expectancy was 47 years old, or for men, 47 years old. I don't know how for women. Fuel for cars was only sold in drugstores. Only 14% of homes had a bathtub. Only 8% of homes had a telephone. The tallest structure in the world was the Eiffel Tower. It wasn't even one of our buildings here in America. The average U.S. worker made between $200 to $400 a year.
Whoa.
More than 95% of all births took place at home. Sugar was 4 cents a pound. Eggs were 14 cents a dozen. Coffee was 15 cents a pound. They would have a heart attack at Starbucks. Most women washed their hair only once a month using borax or egg yolks. Dr. Dana and I have no comment on that. The population of Las Vegas,
no right
Nevada,
to comment.
The population of Las Vegas, Nevada was 30.
Wow.
30 people. 30 people. Crossword puzzles, canned beer, and iced tea had not yet been invented. Canned beer, no life without canned beer. That's going to take us into suffering. There was neither a Mother's Day nor a Father's Day. Spanish flu infected about 27% of the world's population, estimated to have killed at least 50 million people. Putting COVID into some context here. Mm-hmm. Women could only just vote. I think it was 1920. Jim Crow still in existence. Jews couldn't join most country clubs. Infant mortality rate was close to 50%. The list goes on and on. Why am I taking us back 100 years? Because they had every reason to suffer. I mean, I read down some of those lists, like no canned beer. And what a life that must have been. So difficult.
Brings tears to my eyes.
But seriously, there's some real stuff, as we say in Yiddish, to fetch about, to complain about, to say, yes, you have every right to talk about suffering. I want to fast forward 100 years later, and it isn't to say we don't have a right to suffer. I do want to get into the conversation, though, of who suffers more. Did they suffer more? Do we suffer more? It seems like every time I open up the newspaper, so to speak, I turn on social media, and there's just suffering after suffering after suffering. I don't think that was Ma's experience. I don't think that was my grandparents' experience. I don't think that they experienced their life through the lens of suffering quite like we do in 2023. What do you say about all this, my friend?
Yep, I totally agree. If we take it down a logotherapeutic path, we suffer more because we have more free time, more leisure, less values, less direction, more, as Dr. Frankl says, more existential vacuum. As the great Uncle Ben Parker says, uncle to Spider-Man himself, with great power comes great responsibility. And you and I have talked about the idea, with great freedom comes great responsibility. And we have that great freedom, but we don't seem to have the responsibility to use it wisely yet. And just using your example of canned beer, right? I could leave this podcast, be gone for 4 minutes, and come back with a fresh, cold 6-pack of delicious cold beer. And then, drink all of my stress and problems away within an hour. But that's a problem, right? Like, if you think about it, the work of having to either produce or procure certain luxury items, even just common day items, right? To wash your hair, do things like that. The work of doing these things was meaningful. And because we don't have to maybe work as hard and we have more vacant space in our day, in our lives, maybe we suffer because we're not sure how to utilize that time yet.
So really, I'm not just saying this to sort of be provocative or to, I don't know, set it up so that you answer it, but like, what is suffering? I mean, we say this over and over again, this word, and we're comparing their suffering and our suffering. But sometimes, at least in my head, I think I confuse pain, right? Physical, something tactile, tangible that hurts with suffering. So maybe we could just flesh out a little bit of what is suffering, because I think that that's partially what I felt when I'm reading these statistics 100 years ago. Like, did somebody suffer because they didn't have a phone, because they didn't have a bathtub, because they didn't have canned beer? Is that a suffering?
Well, I would say those around a person without a bathtub may have suffered a bit. Um,
Good one.
but yeah, probably got used to it. But no, I don't think that was genuine suffering. In fact, I mean, come on, we complain about uh, the prolific and ubiquitous use of smartphones so much. We suffer because of that. Imagine you couldn't call or text the people you care about most. You had to take the time to journey, to visit them and be in their presence, to have a conversation. That's true connection. I don't think that's suffering. But as we've accelerated our growth and evolution and technological prowess, I think maybe in some ways we haven't been ready for the advances we've made, and maybe those have caused some form of suffering as we've
Yeah, it's really
learned how to utilize them in a meaningful way.
so. I think part of what we're talking about here is just really redefining this word, this idea, this concept of suffering. Because when I talk to people and they're talking about the suffering that they're like, I just did this. I was telling you about my suffering prior to our call about my RV is in the shop, and we've missed literally 5 trips that we were going to go on, small little, whatever. And if I'm not careful, I'll really believe that's suffering. And if I do that
Mhm.
all day, every day with, somebody cut me off in traffic and the line at the store was like so long and I was just so hard. I was so mad. I think part of it is challenging the word we're using, because when we use the same word for all these experiences, it becomes meaningless. One example, I have teenage daughters. Every time they hang up their phone with their girlfriends, it's, oh, I love you. I love you too. I love you. I love you. If you use I love you that much, you're not even saying I love you anymore. You're just saying goodbye.
Mhm.
Right. And so we have to be very mindful or conscientious about the words we're using.
Well, and I think a thoughtful consideration of what true suffering is definitely, brings it. I think there's a balance to be had there, right? I mean, there are people in the world who are truly suffering, don't have clean water, or eating diseased food, or children dying of terminal illnesses. Yeah, you and I aren't experiencing that, and maybe some of our audience might be or may not be, but I think we also risk. Uh, Maybe there is a risk in comparing our suffering to others. None of us in this time, but not many, I would say, there are few surviving people who have endured the Nazi concentration camps. Most of us have not had to endure that level of suffering. But does that mean we haven't suffered in life?
No, and I'm going to push back on this and say that's not where I'm going, and because I just hung up with the phone with a woman who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness. That's not
Yeah.
That's her suffering. I mean, that's as real as it gets. But for somebody else, I was talking to them and they have tinnitus or tinnitus, and
Hmm.
it's really wreaking havoc on their life. And just compare the two is pointless because it's legitimately causing them suffering. I guess for me, I'm just saying I want to have an ability to have a distinction in my own life between, look, I miss my dad every single day of my life. There's a suffering component that is there. I miss my RV during the summer. It's not exactly the same thing. And
Right.
one is suffering and one is just an annoyance. Right? One's frustrating. So that's what I'm saying, getting back to a nuance of language for my own self. Naming
Hmm.
it, that's frustrating, that's annoying, that's a pain in the ass. This is suffering. And I'm not
Hmm.
saying, and I know you're not saying that suffering can only be reserved for the mega life experiences.
Right. We suffer a
So
little bit every day, right? We all experience it in some degree. But as we know, it's what we do about it, right? Suffering that can be changed, some suffering that we can do something about. We are bound to do something about it, because refusing to do something about suffering, right, to change it if we can, is just masochism, right? Is just for some people, it's just enduring for the need for attention or to say how much they're suffering. But the suffering of modern day often can be changed. But then there is true suffering in the world: terminal illnesses, betrayals, how we treat each other sometimes, that we can't always change, but we get to choose how we deal with it, how we cope with it, how we grow, how we learn from it.
and we both know that's one of the great contributions of Frankel and logotherapy is that it presents suffering. So we've now just kind of sort of distinguished, kind of getting rid of the things that are annoying, that are whatever. But like you're saying, there are right now, and everybody who's listening can find something in their life that is legitimate suffering. When you start, going through the annoyance list, yeah, a lot of it falls away, but there's always something in our lives. And when we come to that thing that's truly suffering, as Frankel taught, it's a new approach to suffering. One of the things that I think our society has been very focused on is it's not supposed to be there, right?
Mhm.
You're not supposed to have it. It's an anomaly, it's abnormal, as opposed to every other era of human history, which is suffering is a human reality. You can't get rid of it so easily. You can't have cold beer all the time. And what do you do with it when you run into the suffering? Well, Frankel, one of his strategies was, can you bear the burden of your suffering? What does that mean, Dr. Dan?
Well, I mean, to your point, the greatest stories throughout history, throughout ancient history, have been about suffering, have been about the tragic hero bearing their burden and growing from it. And that's what we're challenged to do today. And I think, in a way, that answers your question. What does it mean to bear your suffering? As I talked about in our meeting mastermind last week, Dr. Frankel talks about the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death, all forms of human suffering that we can't escape. And he balances that with tragic optimism. What do we do with suffering? What do we do with pain? We are challenged to turn it into some form of achievement or accomplishment. We're challenged to grow from it.
And it's uniquely yours. I don't care if you're going through a loss and your friend's going through a loss. They're not the same loss. They're different people. You're different people. It's uniquely yours. I mean, what, what in our life is really uniquely ours? And it's a new way to think about, this is my, do I want it? I don't want it. Like
Mhm.
I say all the time, I trade in everything I've learned and experienced positively from my dad's death for my dad. But that ain't the choice. Either it's meaningless and I'm without him, or it's meaningful and I'm without him. Though that's the choice. And so this is uniquely mine. I got to go into it to find what's uniquely meaningful to me. And that all of a sudden becomes almost like a task, a job, a mission.
Yeah, it is our mission. I believe that mission gives life, well, gives life meaning. It gives life purpose. It gives us that robustness of seeking out the answer to our suffering. As I heard you recounting that story, I sat here thinking of some of the just the past week in my clinical practice, and even some of the coaching I do. I thought, oh my God, I deal in suffering. I truly deal in suffering on a daily basis. I like deal, not like work with, but like I feel like a poker dealer at dealing out suffering and helping people um, change their hand as it comes to their suffering. And that's
Or play their or play their
or
hand.
play their hand. As we talked about the other day, where'd that post-it go? It had on my computer. As you said, our modern culture wants us to get over it, to take a pill to manage it. I've heard of physicians doling out antidepressants for people going through grief and loss. I think, my goodness, let them be in it. That's what we talked about yesterday. Being in it, enduring it, embracing it, sitting with it, and allowing it to change you, embracing it. That's the mission, not getting over it, not sweeping it under the rug, not giving yourself 2 weeks to grieve and saying, okay, I'm good now. Life doesn't work that way.
And I'm guilty of this. My Enneagram type is the 8, the challenger, the push through, the fight, the get through it. And I find myself telling myself that. I find myself telling others that. And I think there's a time to power through, but there's also a time just can you just sit in it? Can you not move? Can you not try and fix? Can you just stand or sit in what you're in? This is the idea behind in Jewish mourning, the Shiva process. A
Mhm.
lot of people know after in Jewish tradition, after somebody dies, you sit for 7 days. And what do? Nothing. You just sit there for 7 days in the darkness, in the tears, in the grief, or in the nothingness. I mean, maybe you're not crying, but can you just sit for 7 days? Now, at the end of 7 days, you got to get up and go out into the world. But it's a challenge. I'm not saying I do it all the time or others do it, but it's a challenge. I think it is also countercultural to the world we live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Too often in the world we live in, it is a get over it attitude. Get over it and move on. That's that eight
More
hole.
power. Yeah,
Power through it.
power.
Absolutely. I want to bring up a quote you shared from one of Dr. Frankel's favorite authors. Not just Dr. Frankel, but our good friend Dr. Jordan B. Peterson as well. Often quotes the Russian officer Dostoevsky. And you shared this the other day as we were talking about this topic. If I may steal your quote, there's only
Yeah, no.
one thing that I dread: not to be worthy of my sufferings. These words frequently came to mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in concentration camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their sufferings. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. That goes back about
Also,
100 years, doesn't it?
yeah,
Maybe even more.
late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
I was a philosophy major, and it's been a long time since I read like Crime and Punishment and whatever else he wrote. But I do remember that he was a struggling artist, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he died, I think, penniless. I remember he blew all his money on poker, maybe, or roulette or something. His wife died, his brother died. Like, he had a miserable life.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a man who's writing from the ivory tower, right? Theory. This is a man who's in it, and he's saying it. And I think that's why I've always liked Dostoevsky. That's why I love Frankel. Like, he was
Mm-hmm.
writing it in it, not
Mm-hmm.
just pontificating like us.
Yeah, well, right, true. I think the thing about Frankel is he took that suffering and he truly turned it into human achievement. He took, he had his theories and ideas before the concentration camps, but he had to really use them and test them. And they were found, I mean, he found them to work. And so then he committed his life to continuing to share them. And going back to the
Okay.
point, no, you and I have not, okay, go ahead. You got something.
No, I'm just going to challenge you, but keep finishing, and then I'll
Well,
challenge you.
as I was saying, you and I have not endured the concentration camps, but we've endured our own true suffering in different ways, either in the loss of loved ones or people we care about, or in different ways. And we've found ways to work through it, work
or
around it.
or not even work through it, or not even work around it, but just get my ass handed to me and still standing. Like for me, it's a low bar, but my father killed himself, my grandmother killed herself, and I've always told myself that the one thing that is not an option is to be a third generation. And
Right.
so if I'm breathing, if I'm talking, if I'm still above ground, that means I am, still standing, literally and
Mhm.
figuratively. And sometimes that's what I think we got to get to when we put on people this Herculean, hero's journey of orders of magnitude big, live your life, start a new organization after the death of a child and
Mm,
change the world. Like, okay, but survive.
yeah.
Like surviving can be heroic. Just survive.
Yeah, I think sometimes actually surviving and carrying on is more heroic because often we can get distracted, maybe addicted to the pursuit of big time organizations. And don't get me wrong, I've been a part of some of those, and I've they do great work. But sometimes those that seek that are forgetting to do their own work of grieving or being in their loss, their suffering.
Totally. Of all the funerals that I did, I remember so many got to good works, got to starting the foundation, got to making it matter too quickly. The
Mm,
child died and they're already out trying to figure out how to redeem it and fix the broken world, which is beautiful, but not as a form, we've had this conversation, not a form of
right.
bypassing the darkness, bypassing your emotions, bypassing just surviving.
Mhm. So
Okay, so
curious. Go
yeah,
ahead. You're going to
so
challenge.
go, go, go,
Nope,
go.
you first. Well, I'm
So
just curious. Go ahead.
I'm I'm gonna play the role that I get, variations of this all the time, but I come to you as a client and Dr. Dan, this is great, but like my husband just cheated on me and left me with two small kids and he's totally narcissistic and I gotta like, figure out how to live. And you're telling me, right, that there's blessings in this burden? Like, screw you. Blessings in this burden.
Well, you might not want to hear what I have to say in the beginning if you're so angry and ready just to yell at your therapist, coach, whatever you might want to call me. But ironically, I mean, I was just dealing with this morning, in a and I had to apologize to the young gentleman I was dealing with because I was smiling for him, I was beaming, I was excited for him. Um, just a real difficult path of the past few years of marriage filled with infidelity, and breaks from the breaks in the marriage and some substance use and addiction. I said, man, I am excited for where you get to go from here. The fact that you and I are talking and you're willing to give yourself over to make some changes and to realize, yeah, don't get me wrong, your pain right now is real. What do you want to do with it? Because you can't go back to addiction and substance use. That hasn't led anywhere. So what do you want to do with it? How can you sit in it? How can you let it allow it? How can you allow it to change you in a positive way instead of the negativity you've been working in? And from there, I've worked in marital infidelity for quite a while and have seen those willing to be in it, to do the work, to take both sides, take responsibility. Man, some amazing things come from that. Time is a great healer, but doing the work of, as we've talked about, taking personal responsibility, embracing suffering and growing from it can yield, well, that crisis can yield a more beautiful marriage than what was there previously.
So there was, like you said, Dostoevsky said, "There's only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." And um, this is something that I have conversations about every single day. It's not, to that woman who came storming in your office and yelling at you, right? I don't. I wish you could go back, unwind it, and be at the wedding canopy 20 years earlier and have a do-over, but you can't. So worthy of your suffering, right? can you step into this as yours and yours alone to own, to carry, to,
Mhm.
yeah, eventually transform tragedy into triumph, as Dr. Frankel
Mhm.
said.
And as we talk about often between you and I and the podcast, to take responsibility for these things don't happen in a vacuum. Where can you take responsibility, learn, and grow from it? Yes, that partner, that husband has dealt you an ugly hand, but where can you learn from that experience? Would you want to go back 20 years and change the 20 years completely? Probably not, because I'm betting there was some good that came of it. But right now, it's not. What do you want to do about it? How do you want to be in it and grow from it?
Worthy of our burdens. I think even when I say that, it's a whole new way to approach burden, struggle, suffering. And we don't only have to be talking about, again, the mega moments. We can be talking about um, the struggle of, like, you're in a job that's not fulfilling, but you got to pay the bills. And
Hmm.
so, like, worthy of showing up and doing this and paying those bills, and just worthy of the burdens. To me, even just sort of as a mantra, is helpful.
I agree. I we bring it up often. We live in a time where we get to choose just about everything that goes into our head. And if we, into our mind, into our being, we get to learn. We have all the past thousands of years of history and experience in the palm of our hands. There's no reason not to grow from these sufferings, right? It used to be, I don't know what to do. Okay. Well, then you need to seek guidance, but you can always find something to do now, to learn, to grow, to commune, to connect with other suffering people, and again, to find ways to become better because of it. I think that is what we need in human nature. That's why suffering has been written about for thousands of years. It's the human condition, but we also get to choose what we do about it.
I'll start wrapping it up here, but I want to share from Man's Search for Meaning. Again, for those who don't know, this was written in the Holocaust. This was written in the context, or it was written afterwards, but it was in the context of a
Mhm.
concentration camp that it was imagined. Frankel says, once the meaning of suffering had been revealed to us, the prisoners, we refused to minimize or alleviate the camp's tortures by ignoring them or harboring false illusions and entertaining artificial optimism. Suffering had
Mm.
become a task on which we did not want to turn our backs. We had realized its hidden opportunities for achievement, the opportunities which caused the poet Rilke to write, how much suffering there is to get through. Right? There was plenty of suffering for us to get through. To me, this is how you take back your power, right? Your
Mhm.
responsibility, your ability to respond is by no longer sitting around and saying, why me? Like, it has its place, it has its time, but it is an unanswerable question. And as one of Frankel's students and another Holocaust survivor, Edith Eger, said, the
Mhm.
shift from victim to survivor is victims say, why me? Survivors say, now what?
Now
Right
what?
now, what can I do with this suffering? And that's a paradigm shift.
Go back. There was a two-word phrase used in there that I've already forgotten because I've taken it to modern times. What was that about? A false optimism or positive? What was that?
Yeah. False illusions and entertaining an artificial optimism.
Artificial optimism. What do we call that today, B? Is that not toxic positivity today?
Toxic positivity.
Ugh,
Yes.
right? Like, ugh, so gross. Like, it just, if every, I've been, this has got me in trouble a couple times as I've been trying to ignore my suffering. And my wife asked, "How you? Everything okay?" I've had some injuries lately. Hey, how's your knee doing? And I just look at her and I give her the old Lego movie answer. Everything's awesome. She
Everything.
goes,
You got to sing it.
yeah, right. She has some really unpleasant things to say. I cannot repeat without pressing the explicit button. But and everything isn't awesome. And we don't have to engage in this false positivity. We don't have to take medication to make it better. Sometimes it's just being in the suffering and growing from it. And as Edith tells us, coming up with, now what? What can I do now?
Yeah, one of our favorite movies, and then we really will wrap it up because the Running Man's about done. Is one of our favorite TV shows, of course, is Ted Lasso.
Mm,
And for those of you who haven't watched, I guess it's a spoiler alert. You might want to hit pause. It's not much of one, but the TV show, I wondered how it was going to go into a second and third season. The first season was fun; it was great, but you didn't see. You saw all you really saw was toxic positivity. I mean, Ted is a case study in toxic positivity until he faces the darkness, his particular burdens, and he starts finding. He starts just wanting to be worthy of those burdens, to carry them as opposed to run from them. And to me, that was the shift. And when this TV show became epic, like it was fun
mhm.
and funny, but then it became like truly profound because I saw the man grow in a way that, obviously character, but it's the piece in all of us that couldn't have grown without the struggle, without the burdens. And that was when it
Absolutely.
flipped, right? It's no longer the burdens are no longer an obstacle. It's actually the pathway.
Without that darkness in the series, it goes back to what it first was, and it was just a campy beer commercial with a guy with a funny accent. But with that darkness, with the trials, with the struggles that he and so many other characters on the show endured, embraced, and grew through. I mean, that's what made that show, as you said, epic, truly beautiful. And I can't tell people enough. Like, once you get through all the episodes of the Meaning Academy and the Defiant Spirit and the Meaning Project podcast, I mean, I think your next dive is into Ted Lasso and seeing the beauty and the meaning and the struggle and the suffering in that series.
So I'll end with this, not Frankel. It is Rilke, and I'm just paraphrasing, but it just really weighs on me all the time. Life is about being defeated by ever bigger problems, right? And so it's reframing the struggles you're going through, the burdens you're enduring, the darkness that you're facing, not as something to, be looked at as an anomaly, shouldn't be here. It is here. How do we know it should be here? Because it's here. Now, what do you do with it? Now, what? And ultimately moving through it to ever bigger problems and growing through the process. Any final words, my brother, Dr. Dan?
No, man, I need to save my voice for the upcoming in a few minutes here. B and I are going to transfer over to the Meaning Mastermind. Now, you're probably catching this after the Meaning Mastermind, so you're going to miss us recounting this idea with our group of meaning seekers. What a wonderful group of people we have on a rotating basis. Some people have been there every time, others pop in when they can, and many others still listen to the recording on our Facebook page. But I got to tell you, it's so fun doing what you and I get to do here and taking it to a live audience with our friends, Dr. Elise Cortez and Scott Schaffman, and all those other people there. And not just you and I talking the academics of what we talk about here, but really bouncing around with real world problems. So if you have the opportunity, I would highly encourage you jump on over 3 p.m. Eastern every Thursday. Sign up for the weekly mailer at themeaningacademy.com or .org, and you'll find out all about what we're getting ready to talk about. And you are welcome to, as B and I said, give us some ideas. Let us know what you want to talk about, what you want to learn. Use this as your opportunity to have us, bounce some questions around.
And with that, live your life with meaning, purpose, and resilience. We'll catch you in the next podcast.
Take care, everybody.